All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We try to bring you the most important stuff out there, try to make sense of it all. And today we're diving into something that's pretty big.
Yeah, this one has a lot of moving parts.
You can say that again. We're talking about a potential ceasefire. 30 days, a whole month without fighting. At least that's the idea.
It is. And this is coming right on the heels of a meeting, some pretty high-level talks between the U.S. and Ukraine.
Right. And, we got to remember the backdrop here. It's not like everything's been calm. There was, a pretty significant drone attack recently.
Oh, absolutely. That definitely adds another layer of complexity to all this.
Yeah, for sure. So let's try to unpack this, all right. What do we know about this potential ceasefire? And just as important, what are the conditions attached to it?
Well, the first thing you got to understand is that this isn't something that just came out of nowhere. There were these discussions in Jeddah, that's in Saudi Arabia, by the way, between a U.S. delegation and a Ukrainian delegation.
Okay, so two sides talking it out. What came of that?
Well, they released a joint statement. And the big headline from that statement, a proposal for a 30-day ceasefire.
30 days. That's a decent chunk of time, I guess. Enough to at least catch your breath a little.
Yeah, could be. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. Ukraine has said, okay, we're open to this. But.
There's always a but.
Always. Their acceptance is completely dependent on Russia doing two things.
Okay, what are they?
First, Russia's going to agree to the ceasefire, obviously. And second, they have to actually implement it at the same time as Ukraine.
Gotcha. So no one's jumping the gun here. It's going to be a synchronized thing.
Exactly. It's not a unilateral move.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, alongside all this talk about a ceasefire, we've also seen reports that the U.S. might be sweetening the deal a little bit.
Oh, yeah. How so?
Well, apparently they've pledged to reverse the pause on sharing intelligence with Ukraine. And they're also talking about restarting military aid.
Interesting. That's a pretty big commitment if you think about it.
It is. What do you make of that? Is it like a show of good faith? A way to maybe nudge Russia towards saying yes?
It could be. I mean, on the one hand, it definitely sends a strong message to Ukraine that the U.S. has got their back, even if a ceasefire does go into effect.
Right. That they're not being left out in the cold.
Exactly. But on the other hand, it could also be a way of saying to Russia, look, even if we pause the fighting, we're not backing down. Our support for Ukraine isn't going anywhere.
So kind of like a carrot and a stick situation.
Maybe a little bit of both. It's definitely a way to add some weight to the proposal, try to make it more appealing to both sides.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, beyond the whole military side of things, it sounds like there were also some important conversations about, people. The people caught in the middle of all this.
Absolutely. The delegations talked about humanitarian efforts, stuff like exchanging prisoners, and even, and this is really important, the return of children.
Yeah, that's a huge one. These aren't just statistics. These are real lives that have been completely disrupted.
Exactly. And I think it's really interesting that they included this in the discussions. It's like they're saying, look, even during this potential 30-day pause, we got to address some of the immediate human impact of this conflict.
Right. It's not just about stopping the shooting. It's about trying to start putting things back together, even if it's just a little bit.
Right. And it might even help build some trust, some momentum for more substantial talks later on down the line.
Makes sense. Now, speaking of talks, it looks like this isn't just about a temporary break in the fighting.
What do you mean?
Well, the reports say that both the U.S. and Ukrainian sides have agreed to put together their own negotiation teams.
I see where you're going with this.
Yeah. And their goal is to start talks, real talks, aimed at finding a stable peace. And eventually, they're talking about a lasting security arrangement for Ukraine. That sounds pretty serious, pretty ambitious.
It is. And I think that's the real takeaway here. The fact that they're forming these negotiation teams shows that they're not just kicking the can down the road, they're actually trying to create a path forward.
Yeah, trying to find a way out of this mess. But of course, like we said before, none of this can happen without Russia.
Right. That's the elephant in the room, so to speak.
Absolutely. And it looks like the U.S. knows that. They've said they're going to discuss these proposals directly with Russia.
Which, let's be honest, is the only way this has any chance of actually working. You can't have a ceasefire, you can't have peace talks without involving all the key players.
Right. It takes two to tango, and in this case, it takes, at least three.
Exactly. And the U.S. reaching out directly to Russia, that's a big deal. It's acknowledging that Russia has a crucial role to play in all of this.
Okay, so the U.S. is talking to Ukraine. They're planning to talk to Russia. But there's another piece of this puzzle, right?
What's that?
Well, Ukraine has also been pretty vocal about wanting their European partners involved in the peace process. It's like they're saying this isn't just a regional issue, it's a European issue.
Yeah, I see what you mean. That's actually a really important point. Ukraine wants this to be a broader effort with more international support and legitimacy.
Right. It's like they're saying, we need the whole team here.
Exactly. And it makes sense, doesn't it? Having European partners involved adds more weight to the process, more diplomatic pressure. And it also acknowledges that this conflict has implications for European security as a whole.
Definitely. It's not just about Ukraine, it's about the bigger picture.
Right. And then there's another interesting development that we should talk about.
What's that?
Well, the U.S. and Ukraine have also agreed to finalize an agreement on resources, specifically resources within Ukraine. And they're saying they want to do this as quickly as possible.
Resources. What kind of resources are we talking about?
Well, they're being a little vague on the specifics right now, but the idea is that this agreement will help strengthen Ukraine's economy.
Okay, so it's about more than just guns and tanks. It's about making sure Ukraine can stand on its own 2 feet economically.
Right. It's about their long-term prosperity and security. It's about giving them the tools they need to not just survive this conflict, but to thrive afterwards.
Makes sense. It's like a two-pronged approach. Address the immediate crisis, but also lay the groundwork for a stable future.
Exactly. And that's a really smart strategy, I think.
Now, in the midst of all this, we've also heard some interesting things from U.S. officials.
Oh, yeah. What have they been saying?
Well, Secretary of State Rubio has been pretty positive. He said the Kyiv, that's Ukraine's capital, for those who don't know, has taken positive steps. And he's expressed hope that Russia will, follow suit.
Interesting. And what about the White House? What's their take on all this?
Well, they've described the meeting between the U.S. and Ukrainian teams as productive. So, generally optimistic vibes coming from the U.S. side.
Yeah. And those public statements are important. It's their way of putting a positive spin on things, encouraging Russia to come to the table.
Right. It's part of the whole diplomatic dance, trying to build some momentum.
Exactly. But now comes the really interesting part.
Okay. Spill the beans. What is it?
Well, it sounds like the U.S. is planning some pretty high-level outreach to Russia, like really high level.
Okay, you got to give me more than that. What are we talking about?
We're talking about President Trump's special representative, Steve Witkoff. He's expected to head to Moscow this week. And get this, there's even a chance he could meet with President Putin himself.
Wow, that's a big deal. And it's not just Witkoff, right?
Right. President Trump's advisor, Mike Waltz, he's also planning to talk to Russian representatives soon to discuss, the whole ceasefire proposal.
So a two-pronged approach there as well. Special envoy plus direct communication from a top advisor.
Exactly. The U.S. is pulling out all the stops to try and get Russia on board with this.
Makes sense. I mean, and like we've been saying, Russia's agreement is make or break for this whole thing.
Absolutely. And having Witkoff potentially meeting with Putin, that could be huge. It would be a very clear sign that the U.S. is taking this very seriously.
Yeah, no kidding. Now, we've also heard from President Zelensky himself. He gave his perspective on the meeting.
Oh, yeah. What did he have to say?
Well, he said that during the meeting, Kyiv proposed a ceasefire, not just on land, but also at sea and in the air.
Interesting. So they're really trying to cover all the bases.
Yeah. And he also said that they proposed an exchange of prisoners.
Okay. So basically trying to de-escalate things on all fronts.
Right. And Zelensky thanked President Trump for the way the discussions went, called them constructive. But then he said something really important. He basically said, look, Ukraine is ready for this 30-day ceasefire.
But here we go again.
He said the U.S. needs to convince Russia to agree to it as well.
Right. So even though Ukraine is on board, the ball is still in Russia's court.
Absolutely. Now, we also have to talk about something that happened recently, something that could make this whole ceasefire thing a lot more complicated.
What are you talking about?
The drone attacks.
Yeah.
The UN has condemned attacks on civilians and infrastructure.
Right. That was after Ukraine launched those drone attacks on Russian regions.
Exactly. And the UN's not happy about it. Their spokesperson, Stefan Dujarric, said these kinds of attacks shouldn't happen again. They're calling for de-escalation, an immediate end to the fighting.
Yeah, I saw that. And Russia's reaction, well, let's just say they weren't too pleased.
Understatement of the year.
Seriously. They reported a huge number of drones used in that March 11th attack. And their UN representative, he didn't mince words, called it a display of Ukraine's true terrorist essence.
Wow. So not exactly helpful for building trust and goodwill, is it?
Not really. And you got to wonder, how's all this going to affect Russia's willingness to even consider a ceasefire?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. I mean, on the one hand, you've got Ukraine saying they're ready to stop fighting. But then on the other hand, you have this major attack and a very angry response from Russia.
It's a tough situation, and it makes you wonder if this ceasefire proposal, even if it does get agreed to, can actually hold.
Right. Because even if they do agree to a ceasefire, it doesn't mean the underlying tensions just disappear.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole thing so fragile. So where does that leave us?
Well, we know the U.S. is pushing hard for Russia to agree to this 30-day ceasefire. And they've made it clear that if Russia does agree, the next step would be actual negotiations.
Real talks, not just back and forth through intermediaries.
Exactly. But the big question mark, the one that hangs over everything, is whether Russia will actually play ball.
And that's what makes the next few days so crucial. Will they see this as a genuine opportunity for de-escalation? Or will they see it as, well, a sign of weakness, something to be exploited?
Yeah, we'll have to wait and see. But there's one more thing that's important to remember, something we haven't really touched on yet.
What's that?
The drone attacks. Ukraine could launch another one any day. And if they do, well, who knows what the consequences will be for this whole ceasefire idea.
Yeah, that's the wild card in all this. It's a very real possibility, and it could completely derail everything.
Absolutely. So let's recap. Ukraine is open to a 30-day ceasefire. But it all depends on Russia agreeing and implementing it at the same time. And even if they do agree, there's no guarantee it'll hold.
It's a very delicate situation, a lot of moving parts, a lot of potential for things to go wrong. And that leaves you with this. Given everything we've talked about, the drone attacks, Russia's anger, Ukraine's willingness to potentially resume those attacks, what do you think? What are the realistic odds of the ceasefire actually happening? And if it does happen, what are the chances it actually holds? Something to think about.
It is indeed. A lot to ponder. And hey, if you want to keep up with this story and others like it, make sure to subscribe to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We're here to make things clear every single day.